Almost 13-something years ago, an Anon was playing a typical game of World of Warcraft, and he sees the vastness of the ocean and decides to go exploring in it. The Anon catalogs what happens as his character delves deeper and deeper into the abyss. Things get darker and darker. Tensions start to rise as his command prompt starts giving him eerie and foreboding messages. The entire thread starts to wonder where this could be going. What could this all end in? Is his game gonna crash? Is he going to get devoured by some eldritch abomination beyond our comprehension? Well, he finally reaches the bottom, and his discovery was a true travesty indeed. After this discovery was made, the entire tone of the thread shifted. All the build-up to this punchline, it was hysterical. To them back in 2012, this was the funniest thing ever. But you probably have no idea why this is so funny to them. That's because this entire thing requires a ton of context. And in order to get that context, we're gonna have to go back. Way back. In the early 2000s, a duology of games known as Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was released, a set of groundbreaking RPGs set in the Star Wars universe, and are considered by many to be the best Star Wars games ever made. The games were major critical and commercial successes, praised by many for their story, characters, and their connection with the Star Wars franchise.
Playing Knights of the Old Republic, you will more than likely appreciate this game's really obviously good qualities and just the obvious and sheer amount of effort and talent and work that went into this game. It's just really an impressive experience by and large, and is easily recommendable to anyone who has an Xbox, and even to those still on the fence on whether or not to get the system.
Anyone who grew up with an original Xbox or PC back in the day probably at least heard of them and their reputation. There hadn't been a Star Wars game like it, or since. I used to watch my brothers play the second game on their backwards compatible 360 back in the day, and they would play it non-stop for hours. Of course, I tried to play them too, but I think around the time they were a bit above my punching weight. I had no idea what an RPG was or how they worked, so I just got my ass whooped a lot. BioWare and Obsidian Entertainment had really struck gold here. And why end it off on a duology? Why not make one of the greatest trilogies in the history of Western RPGs? Well, as many would know, there was no Knights of the Old Republic 3. It never happened. It was in development, but it was canned. How and why do you cancel something that was guaranteed to be a success no matter what? You see, Knights of the Old Republic was made in a time before the landscape of PC RPGs was drastically changed. Around the time Knights of the Old Republic 2 came out, a small little indie game called World of Warcraft was released, a game that became a phenomenon and a cultural milestone in the world of PC gaming. People were spending days upon days absorbed into the world that Warcraft had. It went beyond just another MMO that groups of internet nerds played. It broke into public consciousness and was seen all over the place.
Well, Jim, in the past, you would play a game, reach the end, and game over. But now, the virtual experience of these new unending games feels so real, it can literally draw the player into another world.
You know you're a piece of pop culture when South Park makes a full episode dedicated to you.
Looks like you're about to get pwned. Yeah!
World of Warcraft was raking in millions, and was now basically the foundation for every MMORPG going forward. And you can bet a ton of others were now looking to create their own MMOs to get a piece of that pie. This led to an MMO boom where every franchise and every company was trying to make their own. Now, Star Wars already had an MMO out around the time Warcraft was released, Star Wars Galaxies. And even in that game, a ton of stuff was changed after the release of World of Warcraft to fit more in line with it, so that niche was filled, for a couple of years at least. With that battle of MMOs going on, Knights of the Old Republic 3 was cancelled due to a completely unrelated restructure at LucasArts, while it was already well into development. So after that, BioWare and Obsidian just sort of trudged along, doing their own things. BioWare in particular would create Mass Effect, that also went on to become one of the most groundbreaking and influential games of that generation. But while this was happening, the concept of a Knights of the Old Republic MMO had been in the cards since 2005, right after, well, you know. And that year, BioWare had actually created a brand new studio in Texas to focus purely on MMOs. LucasArts at the time was also interested in a Star Wars MMO, and was willing to collaborate with BioWare for this brand new Star Wars MMO. The devs at BioWare and LucasArts would start creating the story, the characters, the worlds, the gameplay systems, everything the game would need in order to compete in an increasingly competitive market. And things are going pretty smoothly. That is, until in 2007, BioWare would make a deal with the devil. BioWare had been purchased by quite possibly the worst company imaginable. Yeah, you know the whole shtick by now. EA is evil, blah blah blah, everyone knows it. But BioWare got hit hard by this purchase. Almost immediately after being purchased, EA started sticking their fingers in every single one of BioWare's pies. EA started canceling a number of projects at BioWare. BioWare had been working on Sonic Chronicles for the DS, but due to EA's meddling, they were ultimately forced to compromise this project and rush to finish what they had done. And on top of that, cancelled any sequels they had in mind. So, you know that infamously awful music in the game? That's EA's fault. They got the reputation they did for a reason. EA, being a corporate giant, loves one thing more than anything else: money. In the late 2000s, being the MMO boom, they smelled the potential cash and wanted it badly. In October of 2008, 3 companies finally announced Star Wars: The Old Republic to the world, which was then slated to come out the following year, but obviously that didn't happen, since MMOs are quite possibly the hardest genre of video game to make. A lot of man hours and time needed to tweak everything to the point of near perfection. I've never developed one myself, but if you ever see a Kickstarter for an indie game, and it's an MMO, run for the fucking hills. EA knew what they had here. A huge Star Wars MMO made by the guys who made one of the best received Star Wars games ever made to compete with World of Warcraft. This was a surefire success. This game was going to be a universe-spanning adventure with spaceship combat. It would have moral choices and story events that would shape the outcome of your adventure. The story itself was going to be a huge focus unlike any MMO had seen before. As the years went by, EA would tease and show off parts of the game at various conventions, and the reactions can tell you everything about how hyped people were. Lines would stretch on for miles at these conventions, all these eager fans wanting to get a taste of that MMO action.
Star Wars: The Old Republic, that's what I'm here for.
I'm very, very psyched.
I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and the thing about this is that it stays true to the brand and stays true to the story.
EA was showing this game off at every single gaming convention there was. You couldn't escape it. To build hype for the game, they did multiple developer logs, talking about the development of the game, discussing the various parts and features of it, and how proud they were of their work.
Star Wars: The Old Republic is really a chance for us to create the ultimate Star Wars game. It's a game that allows you to live in the Star Wars universe.
We've wanted to build a massively multiplayer game at BioWare for probably over a decade now, and of course, our experience working with LucasArts on the Knights of the Old Republic franchise is a natural combination. It's something, we think is just a perfect fusion to build an MMO in the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic space.
EA commissioned comics and created videos piecemealing the lore of the Old Republic, and not to mention incredibly well-animated CGI trailers to hype this game up even further. Over the next 3 years, EA had a marketing bonanza with this game. They were going to make it a success by sheer brute force with the advertising. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing at least one advert for the game, but all this marketing came at a cost. According to estimates, this was, at the time, the most expensive game ever produced with its long development cycle, and the advertising blowout EA was having because they wanted it to be a success. And people were absolutely convinced this game was going to succeed. How could it not? All the hype surrounding it and all the fans seemed to be excited for it. BioWare actually held a closed beta test that you had to enter to get in, and they got so many applicants to get into the beta, it actually crashed their website. There was no way this game would flop. All the time and money that was being poured into it, there's no way it could be bad. Now, where have I seen this sentiment before?
Well, it's Star Wars. It's like the original trilogy was just so phenomenal. People have been awaiting this for like 16 years.
It's grabbing history and maybe going with it and becoming part of it and giving a story to our children.
Multiple articles popped up on how World of Warcraft now had a worthy rival. It was going to be big. But alas, despite the monumental success this game was going to be, there were non-believers amongst us. Ones who thought there was no way this game was going to live up to the hype. In fact, it was going to be a complete disaster. A lot of people didn't trust what EA and BioWare were doing. They were going to screw it up in one way or another. A lot of these non-believers could be found on the video game board of a Taiwanese clay potter image board. The guys on here weren't particularly fond of the fact that this next Knights of the Old Republic game wasn't going to be another single-player RPG, but instead going to be an MMO chasing after a trend. A lot of them were saying it was just going to be another MMO that fails to match up to the level of success that World of Warcraft had. And also around this time, EA and BioWare were also destroying goodwill with their fans, with the likes of Dragon Age 2 being a complete disaster of a game compared to the first one. As more and more info came out about the game, people got hyped, and the non-believers got even more skeptical. If there's one thing V loves, it's to be contrarian. And while everyone else was wetting their panties on how big this game was going to be, more and more of the board started taking a stance against it, just because it went against the most popular sentiment. But this is V. What does their opinion matter? They're one tiny, concentrated image board on the gigantic internet, and the majority of the internet says otherwise. The Old Republic was too big to fail. So the date of the final release got closer and closer after multiple delays, and the people who had pre-ordered the game had few days early access to it, which was a ton of people, mind you. Oh, people were lusting for this game. With thousands of players wanting to take advantage of their early access, of course you're going to be forced into a queue to wait your turn. My favorite thing to do when starting a new game: waiting. It's been reported that these wait times reach several hours, and then when you finally get in, all it takes is one single server issue for you to disconnect, and then it's to the back of the line. Now, if it's like this with just the pre-order people, imagine what it's going to be like when the game officially comes out. December 20th, 2011. Judgment Day. The day the game is officially released to the public. People rush out to buy the game and sign up for it, and within 24 hours, the game has already broken all previous Day 1 MMO records. It had already reached 1 million users, giving it the record of fastest growing MMORPG ever. So, it looks like V was wrong. The game was a success no matter how hard they wanted it to fail, first day sales-wise at least. And then, the people actually started to play the game. People playing the game were already fighting super bosses very early on, those super bosses being the bugs. Oh god, the bugs! They were everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without facing one. Frame rate issues, graphical and texture bugs. There was a glitch where by doing the breakdancing emote, it made you completely invincible, and you would get banned if you used it too much. There are bugs on the planets, there are bugs in space, there were so many bugs, you would think this was a fucking Starship Troopers game, not Star Wars. Oh, and by the way, there were still queue issues. But they were probably even worse now, since there were way more people trying to play the game. Over the next several weeks, players would get through the game, despite numerous issues, and some were satisfied, and others were just disappointed. All that hype and marketing for this? It's not just the fact that the game was broken and very hard to get into to even play, but many felt the game structure itself was lackluster. This was definitely no World of Warcraft killer. As the days went by, people, disillusioned by the quality of the game, started being vocal about a multitude of things, all of their issues, and as you look at the BioWare forums, you can see the general consensus of the boards getting angrier and angrier at the quality of the game, and what little changes they were making to it. The forums became a very negative place, with people canceling subscriptions, and others rushing to defend BioWare on their behalf, telling them to go back to World of Warcraft. Despite all of this, however, EA stated that they were very happy with the Old Republic's launch, only really focusing on the hard numbers, and not the fact that the game was a busted-up car running on prayers. Now, of course, BioWare was taking people's criticisms and were going to address them, so they started doing what most devs do when people are having numerous issues with your game: creating a patch. This patch was set out to fix multiple issues people had with the game and add some new content. This patch was known as the infamous Patch 1.1. After a few weeks, the patch finally rolled out on January 18th, and it did fix a lot of major issues with the game, but it also added one major flaw that everyone was focused on. This new update absolutely destroyed the game's player versus player combat. You see, whenever you engaged in player versus player combat in the Old Republic, you would gain something called Valor, which raised your PvP rank and also allowed you to purchase more gear made for, specifically player versus player combat. For some reason, this new update had a bug that tipped the scales heavily in the Imperial faction's favor. If you joined the Imperial faction, this update made you able to gain way more Valor and purchase more gear significantly faster than the other. And this update also made the planet Ilum the best spot for PvP, as the Valor drop on this planet was insane. So this cold, empty, desolate planet was quickly turned into this. The Imperials had basically trapped anyone that dares step foot on Ilum. They would kill you, then huddle up around the spawn points to kill you again once you respawned, basically trapping you in an endless loop of dying over and over and over again, with no way of escaping, unless you were an Imperial. Now, as you can imagine, the user base wasn't particularly happy about this, and they made their voices heard again. The forums were flooded with complaints on how busted the PvP was now, and people were canceling subscriptions at a rapid pace. BioWare's attempts to make things better with the patch only made them worse. There was no way they could keep up with all the criticism and complaints now, so they decided on a different tactic. Now up to this point, it's been just a company failing to deliver what they promised to their customers. There was no malice from either side involved, well except maybe V, but that's different. What would a great tale be without a great villain? And now, this story has one. Say hello to Stanley Wu. Stanley Wu was a quality assurance analyst at BioWare during this time, and he was also a lead moderator. Stanley became notorious the previous year in the Dragon Age 2 forums for locking and deleting a multitude of threads that criticized the company, or the game, or him, usually with various catchphrases like, "end of line." One time, he even made the threat that they could potentially revoke your game privileges if you showed the boards too much and got banned. If you criticize BioWare or EA, we will take your games from you. Stanley's new tactic with the Old Republic was to do the exact same thing he did with Dragon Age 2 forums. Complete damage control. The number of threads being locked and the number of posts being deleted started ramping up significantly. If you had a gripe with how the game was now, or made a post on how busted everything was, your thread was immediately locked and you were possibly banned. Threads would suddenly have less and less pages as the mods were deleting as much criticism and hate as possible. Multiple topics were locked due to being off topic. Meanwhile, if your thread was kissing BioWare's ass, it got to stay up. BioWare finally made a thread on the Ilum situation, discussing they were fully aware of the issues with the PvP right now and were working to fix it, but they also announced they were not going to be rolling back any of the gains that were already acquired. So the massive lead the Imperial faction had was not going to be altered. They were going to stay on top. Naturally, this just made things even worse. It made people even angrier, which made the developers delete more posts. This is clear-cut censorship. Deleting anything that is critical of your product and banning them to make it look like things haven't gone up in flames. While this was going on, the date for the auto-renewal for your monthly subscription to the Old Republic was coming up, and seeing as there was now a massive wave of people wanting to cancel after this monumental fuck-up, the option to unsubscribe mysteriously vanished, according to some reports. It looked like BioWare had removed the option to unsub so the auto-renewal would kick in by the 20th and they could still get some of your money. And I'm pretty sure that's illegal in more ways than one. BioWare came out and said it was just a bug, but that's an oddly specific bug to be happening when people are mass canceling their subs. People eventually found a workaround and spread it around, only to get smacked down by the mods. If that's not desperation, I don't know what is. The forums were a bigger travesty than the game now. There was no salvaging it. They tried to incentivize people to keep playing with benefits like becoming a founding member, but it all fell on deaf ears. How exactly could this get any worse? V was watching all this unfold in real time, and to them, it was glorious. They all knew this game was going to be a disaster, but not to this scale. The angry players, the banhammer happy mods, and the massive amount of censorship, there was nothing else quite like it. They dubbed it the TORtanic, the giant vessel that was too big to fail, and it failed. Stanley was the ringleader in all this, to make sure no trolls and harassers would have their way in criticizing the game. V saw what was a clear abuse of power and decided there was no saving this ship and they wanted to join in too before it completely sank. Stanley Wu was perceived to be the main antagonist here, and seeing as he's of Asian descent, V took this as an opportunity to majorly piss him off. A bunch of accounts impersonating Stan started popping up, talking in exaggerated racist accents with such names as Stimpy Poo, Stanley the Pooh, Stimp Tippity Hara Poo, and Cows Go Moo. All these accounts were made to specifically piss Stanley off. So now, the BioWare forums are filled with angry customers, trigger-happy mods, racist parody accounts, the game is unplayable, the factions are unbalanced, the game's numbers are dwindling fast, EA stock is crashing into the ocean, Dragon Age 2 still sucks, and breakfast is ruined. The absolute state of this board, and all of it led to many parody videos being made to dunk on the entire thing. So many videos out there recreating the crashing of the Titanic to represent what all of this was now. A disaster. Eventually, after a while, BioWare finally fixed the PvP issues, basically putting a band-aid on an amputated arm, and eventually everything sort of petered off after a while. But the damage was done. While the game sold 2 million copies and had a huge active player base, all the negativity around the game had made that number drop significantly, and by July 2012, EA announced the game was going free to play. A full admission that the game's current market state wasn't sustainable, but this was going to make it way more appealing to way more people. And over time, things got better. More stuff was added over the years, and it had a dedicated player base for the next decade. But in the end, it was no World of Warcraft killer. The game was still sustainable enough that it went on for years. In fact, it's still going on to this day. But in 2023, EA handed off the keys to the service to a third-party company, basically a confirmation that they're done dealing with it, and now it just exists in its own little habitat now. The game survived, but that brief period of time shortly after launch, the absolute madhouse it was, would never be recreated. Oh, but people have tried. They've really tried. The TORtanic was a milestone on V, as the game they predicted would be a failure was a failure, at launch anyway, and the dopamine high they got from that, well, some are still chasing that high to this very day. Every single big game that comes out now, you see a ton of people that want it to be a disaster, wishing and hyping up how much of a disaster this next big game is going to be, just to have another taste of that TORtanic juice. But it almost never happens. The TORtanic was a one-and-done deal. It will probably never happen again. And some just need to accept that. And so ends the legacy of the TORtanic. Now you know the full context of this thread, and why it was so funny to them. They were in the moment. But there exists one more loose end. What happened to Stanley Wu? Well, a few months after the TORtanic incident, it seems he was let go from BioWare, never to ban another troll or parody account again. Perhaps it's for the best, Stanley. The best for us all. God bless, like and subscribe, and good night. And well, maybe after all this transpired, maybe BioWare and EA could finally move on and on to better things. What was the next game they put out after the Old Republic? Those poor bastards.